As a database administrator working in today's environment, you're going to have to understand just some basic aspects of different database structures. So in this video, I want to talk about the two main database structures. And this is another piece of this introductory information that I always talk about when I start teaching anything about databases. And that is almost all databases out there fall into two main categories. There's OLTP and there's OLAP. You're going to encounter these acronyms over and over in all kind of different scenarios. And as an administrator, you need to understand fundamentally what's going on with these two structures and what they mean. So what's the difference between an OLTP database and an OLAP database? Well, let's start with OLTP. OLTP stands for Online Transaction Processing. Now, this is how most databases begin. The databases that we're going to work with in this course on administering SQL Server fall into the category of online transaction processing, OLTP databases. They're used to capture day-to-day business operational data. Now, the way this database is physically structured makes inserting data, updating data, and deleting data very, very efficient. But notice I didn't mention something there, and that is reading data from the database. While this database structure makes inserts, updates, and deletes very efficient, over time, as more and more data goes into the database, selecting or reading data or accessing data in this database becomes less efficient. And as it gets larger and larger, it gets less and less efficient. Understand, online transaction processing database is built this way purposefully because as a business, we've got salespeople on the phones, we've got salespeople out in the field, and when someone's ready to order something and they've made that decision to buy, we want to get that order placed and closed. And especially when we're talking about phone sales, we may have people waiting. Everywhere you call nowadays, you get that. We're experiencing heavy call volume. How many times have you hung up because you simply didn't have the time? Well, the last thing that we want is for the people taking the orders to be sitting there waiting 15 or 20 seconds every time they try to do something with the computer because the database is slow. We want inserts, updates, and deletes as they're taking customer information, placing orders, making changes to inventory. We want that stuff to happen as fast and efficiently as possible. So that is why we have OLTP databases. OLAP databases, that acronym is Online Analytical Processing. Now, how is this different from OLTP? You'll also hear these referred to as a data warehouse or a data mart. Now, there are some technical things that make that not always a proper definition, but this is just kind of how they're generally organized out there and how you'll always hear it. But a database that is an OLAP database is structured to make retrieving data from the database extremely efficient. Now, data inserts are not nearly as efficient as the OLTP database. So now you see the main difference. OLTP databases are designed to insert, update, and delete data very, very quickly, very, very efficiently, but pulling data out is not very efficient, especially as we start to try to pull a lot of data or as a lot of data exists in the database. The OLAP is just the opposite. It's structured to make selecting this data very efficient, but inserting and modifying data in this database is not nearly as efficient. Most databases begin their lives as OLTP. So we start a business or we set up SQL Server, we need to create a database that will collect, manage, and provide access to the data that we need to run the business on a day-to-day basis. And it needs to be very fast and efficient. Now, these efficiencies slowly start to change as the database grows because while we're collecting, managing, and providing access to the data, we're also having to query that data constantly. So a customer calls in and says, hey, I've got a question on my account. We've got to query that information out of the database to look at their account. Then as the database grows and we're adding more stuff and updating and modifying, at some point, some of the people out there in accounting or in high levels of management say, hey, I need to see how many of each product we sold over the last 3 months as compared to the same time a year ago, or how are we doing year to date compared to the last 5 years average, whatever they want to see. And going in and pulling that data out of an OLTP database slows it down. It creates issues. It takes a long time to grab and aggregate or sum and count and average that data. before long, as that OLTP database grows, it just simply becomes less and less efficient. Indexes can be used to make the select query that we use to retrieve the data more efficient. And so we can start to apply indexes to make our select queries go a lot faster. However, the more indexes we add, the more that we make our insert, update, and delete queries less efficient. Keep in mind, the reason we got into the OLTP business was to make our inserts, updates, and deletes very efficient. But as our retrieving starts to suffer, we add indexes to help the retrieving, and it adds the opposite effect of slowing down our inserts, updates, and deletes. Now, what we're always trying to do, especially as an administrator, is create some sort of balance in here. We want to monitor things. We want to provide maintenance that allows the database to kind of function as much as it can. If you can just kind of picture the seesaw you used to play with on the playground, you want that thing to balance, okay? You don't want one side on the ground, the other up in the air. We want the ability for our users to insert, update, and delete to be as efficient as possible, and we want the queries to be as efficient as possible. However, when we start data reporting and aggregation out of these things, it starts to really get tough. And at some point, this just has to be managed differently. Database administrators and designers have a challenge. They have to balance the number of indexes with the usefulness of the indexes to keep the data useful for both query types, inserts, updates, deletes, and selects. Now, at some point, this simply becomes an impossibility. So the solution is to maintain a copy of the data that you have in the OLTP database in a total different database that is structured to make retrieving the data more efficient. Now you have two databases. The OLAP database is born. We keep our OLTP database for managing the day-to-day business for all those fast inserts, updates, and deletes, but we extract that data, make a copy of it, load it into a different structured database, an OLAP, and that OLAP database is where we go to query that historical business analytics decision-making data. This is where the term business intelligence comes from. When you're talking about a business intelligence solution, you're saying we're going to extract data from our OLTP database, put it into what's normally called a data warehouse or an OLAP database, and that is what we're going to connect to provide all this year over year, quarter over quarter, comparing our data to industry standards or whatever. That is how these two databases work together. Understand, as a database administrator, most of the time you're going to be working with OLTP databases, but data continues to evolve out there. And as an administrator, it's very rare nowadays, especially if you're with a large company, that you're not going to be dealing with OLTP and OLAP databases in some form, especially with backups, maintenance, and so forth. So just make sure you understand these two databases, the main difference, and then we'll again touch on these in a couple of ways as we move through the course, but you will bump into this over and over and over out there in the real world. And as you expand your SQL Server specialties and capabilities over the course of your career.